We want to welcome you to the Yukon College Ayamdiggit campus, acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tonquichin Council and the Kwanlin First Nation. We are incredibly lucky to have three superstars in the world of umbrella final agreement negotiations. So we're going to start with the second perspective series. We had one last year, and this is our second one. And we're picking up on the theme of the 25th anniversary of the Umbrella Final Agreement. We want to talk to these gentlemen and find out and learn from them a bit about their experience in what was a transformational time in Yukon history. So I am thrilled to be able to introduce, let's see who's first on here. Oh, I'm dropping stuff already. They're sort of not sitting in this order. They're all negotiators, so they were negotiating where to sit. First, we have Albert Peter. Albert is a citizen of Notchanaik-Dun and is a member of the Crow clan. He served as a regional and community negotiator. Next, we have Victor Mitander, who is the chief negotiator for the Council of Yukon First Nations, formerly known as Council of Yukon Indians. He is Northern Shoshone and a member of the Wolf clan. And then finally, we have Barry Stuart, who's traveled all the way from British Columbia to be here, and he was a Yukon government negotiator at that time. So, gentlemen, the first question, and Victor's got the mic so he can go first. From your perspective, what was the original vision of the Umbrella Final Agreement, and why did you personally get involved?
I grew up in Dawson City in the early 50s and 60s, and I grew up as a non-status Indian. My mom married a Scandinavian from Sweden, and as a result of that, I lost my status. And as a result of the Indian Act, there was very discrimination of that, and I didn't like that because I grew up as a First Nation individual, and I was always told by the institutional people that I was a white person, non-status, basically. So I thought that was wrong, and that had to change. And because of the Indian Act, I got involved. I was a teenager then, and I read about Louis Riel, and Louis Riel got me going about what the injustices are in Canada, particularly with respect to how our lands are being affected and how they're being taken away. And so when I look at my involvement, I was involved from Dawson City as part of the non-status local, and drove to Whitehorse with all the other communities participating, the status and non-status group around the table talking about the way forward. And we just had recently, in 1973, the Calder case, which was the Nisga'a person that took the government of Canada to court on Aboriginal rights and titles, and the courts were split. And then Trudeau said that we were to negotiate an agreement, no more litigation. And this is Prime Minister Elliott Trudeau. And so we commenced negotiations going forward, and because I was a non-status people in Yukon, they had a struggle to be involved and to be a part of the claims generally, because in the past it's always been status Indians, and the Indian Act governed all of that, and so there was a struggle to that. So I got involved, and the Umbrella Final Agreement was to try and fix and point in the right direction what needs to be done to fix those problems that exist between the status and non-status. And so that's my involvement on that. So whichever.
Thanks, Victor.
Masicho Irant, Masicho Nanka, Danflet Isa Dinga, as you can, Dissing Masicho. I thank my relations for allowing us to gather on their land, and I think that it's important as part of it's part of why Vic and I both got involved is to get that recognition by Canada, basically, of the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights within this country. The vision, I guess, at the time, we were primarily guided by the elders, many of whom have passed on now. But their vision was to protect the land, protect the water, the animals, so that we could protect our way of life. The two are directly linked, and that was the primary driving force behind it. And as Victor pointed out, we had artificial divisions between our people created by the government. You had status, non-status. And the elders again of the day said, we want our grandchildren back. They wanted everybody to be together, united as Yukon Indian people. So that was one of the driving forces behind kind of the organizations that evolved over time from the non-status and the status associations. They formed together to become the Council for Yukon Indians. And part of why we had to structure that way, believe it or not, Indians weren't allowed to have bank accounts. We never got the vote until in the 60s, I believe it was. So we had to create societies to be able to fund our activities as Indian people. So that was why at the beginning societies were created, and they continue today. So really the driving force was to protect the land so that we could protect our way of life. And the future generations would have a choice. You could use the modern wage economy, as it's referred to sometime, or your traditional lifestyle, or both. It gave people that choice of how they wanted to live. And of course, like I said, the land, animals, water are all integral to that and key to preserving and protecting that way of life going forward. Why I got involved was fairly simple. The people came to me, my elders, my grandmother and grandfather in particular, and the people in the community wanted me to work with them, to help them. At the time, by trade, I'm an aircraft maintenance engineer. That's what I was trained to do, and that's what I was doing prior to this engagement. And in between jobs, I happened to be working at the old CYI building, which is now torn down, doing drywall and painting. And the chief of the day, my former chief, Robert Hager, asked me if I wanted to go to work for 2 weeks. So here it is 2 weeks later, and I'm still working some 40 years later, so be careful what you agree to. I'll end there, thank you.
Thanks, Albert. Barry?
Is this working? Good. First of all, I'm really glad to see so many young people here, because I think we really forgot. We really forgot what we did, what we intended to do. Sorry, but in preparing for this, I sat down one night at my house and I started to write. 7 hours later, I had a 40-hour speech ready for you. So, how I got involved. Well, I came up here in 1978 and I was the chief judge. And I went around to the communities and I began to realize immediately that the court was doing more harm than good. Driving up here today, I went by the youth jail around the corner. It struck me that maybe Trump built that jail. It's got 3 fences. When I first came here as a judge, we didn't have a youth facility. So every time that a youth did something that warranted sending him to a youth facility, we had everybody in the community trying to find a way to make sure that he wasn't going to be sent out to Edmonton or she out to Edmonton or Vancouver. Old guys cry, so don't get nervous about it. And so one of the main reasons I got involved is Tony Pennicott became the premier and asked me if I wanted to get involved. And I was really interested in seeing that we could do something different for First Nation communities than simply put them in jail, get them into the pipeline that goes to self-destruction, which is take their kids away from their families and shift them all the way up to jails. There's an embarrassing proportion of Aboriginal people, kids in child care, adults in jails. It's just disgusting, and we're still doing it. No matter how many times we tinker with the system, we're still doing it. Is that better? Okay, sorry. I just didn't want you to hear me crying. So I had just finished, before I came here, negotiating independence in a country called Papua New Guinea, in which there were 3 million people who spoke 820 now, I think, different languages. And there was 2 civil wars going on. So I figured, gee, 30,000 people, everybody speaks English. They've been negotiating this for 5 years. This ought to be a 6-month job. Like Albert, I thought, this will be easy. It wasn't. Because it was supposed to be a social contract. It was supposed to be able to create a new beginning for Yukoners. A new beginning that moved us away from racism, moved us away from the same Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Jean Chrétien, who came up in 1969 and said there might be land claims and then decided there wouldn't be, and then the white paper of 1969, which said there aren't any land claims in the Yukon, there aren't any land claims anywhere else, and as far as we're concerned, the responsibility for Aboriginal people should fall to the provinces. That was 1969. So you can imagine that bureaucracy, after 150 years of trying to assimilate Aboriginal people across this country, and the racism that lived in that bureaucracy, suddenly had to turn around and say, we're going to negotiate with First Nations the rights that they got in 1763, a peace treaty after the end of the 7 Years' War, that basically said that Britain realized that there were more Aboriginal military folks in Canada than there were British troops, which had been badly beaten and almost wiped out by the French and the Iroquois. And a lot of people don't know that history, don't know the history of mission schools, don't know the history of what the First Nations have been through. So Peniket was convinced that it had to be a social contract. We had to find a different way to make our differences positive things in the way in which we shared this land. And I think, and I'd be interested to hear Victor and Albert think about that, so that we started out by saying, let's first learn how to respect and trust each other. Remember that? We took a week off, and we had a course from, I'm embarrassed to say this, a bunch of guys from Harvard who I knew from my own previous life of being an environmental lawyer in dealing with major conflicts. They had in the States come up with a different way of dealing with public disputes rather than just the adversarial thing with lawyers. And so I brought them up to say, let's learn how to negotiate in principle. Let's learn how to negotiate so what we build when we negotiate are better relationships. Because 55 years of dealing with conflict, I can tell you this. The only good thing that comes out of a negotiation, the only thing that survives a good negotiation, are good relationships. If you have an adversarial process and you're dealing with a partnership or a marriage or anything else, and that's what you go through, the opportunity that the conflict gives you is lost. And the energy that's in that conflict turns to destructive, negative energy. We wanted to do a land claim that would build relationships that a social contract would need. We failed. There are a number of reasons why we failed, not the least of which the negotiating team that negotiated in good faith and had a new spirit and a sense of trust, we had a lot of fun together. We trusted each other. I think I can say this now because who cares? Our deadline was April the 1st. If we didn't have an agreement by April the 1st, the feds were going to pack up and leave. And we would be left with whatever we were left with. We didn't have an agreement at 2 o'clock in the morning on April 1st. They had one version of the environmental assessment agreement. We had a different one from YTG, and the feds had a different one. We knew we were cooked, but we trusted each other. So we cooked one agreement that had CYI's version of the environmental assessment agreement, another one that had YTG's assessment of the environmental agreement, and a third one that has the feds. And we went to the celebration on Parliament Hill. Victor handed Mike Smith, to Mike Smith his agreement. I handed to Peniket mine, and Whittington handed to the minister his. with an agreement that we would tell our three principals that we were going to spend the next 2 weeks doing a legal writing assessment of the agreement to make sure there weren't any conflicts. All three of us knowing that we could trust each other, that we would find an agreement that we could all live with. And that's what happened. I tell you that story just because it's an example of how we started. But then all of us, at least the government side for sure, handed off the agreement to somebody else who had not been privy to what we did, not been privy to the spirit of the agreement, and off it went. And it's very clear to me that when you bargain in good faith, you have to implement in good faith, and we haven't done that. I don't think anybody's been wrong, it's just been the characters have changed. They didn't experience what we experienced about working together. They didn't experience what we experienced in the First Nation communities. When we started, all of us, you couldn't say out loud in this community, First Nation self-government. Remember that? You couldn't say that out loud. Thanks to the media, who took a really serious interest, and we let them come into our table. We opened up the negotiation table. They really understood it, and they wrote stories that I think changed the attitude of other Yukoners to the notion of First Nation government. I think Ottawa was able to understand some of the people on the federal team. The federal team was wonderful. I said to Pennicott when I started, I am not going to hire a team of bureaucrats. I am not going to hire people who, just because they might favor your government. So who did I hire? I hired Tim Kempy, the person that the Conservatives were schooling to become the new Eric Nielsen. I hired Gerald Isaac, Grand Chief from Dawson. I hired a whole bunch of people to make sure that the mandate that we were trying to get at land claims was a fair social contract so that we could all live together. Now, one thing that I've said to you, as soon as the agreement is signed, it's out of date, right? Any agreement you sign is out of date. Doesn't matter if partnership in a marriage, economic partnership, doesn't matter. The relationships have to keep it together. The biggest flaw we've had, I think, is the fact that we have not maintained those relationships of mutual trust. It took us 5 years to do what it took us 6 months in Papua New Guinea to do. Why is that? You have to ask that. And the basic questions that basically ought to be addressed to Albert and Victor, because they know why it took so long. We didn't have to climb over racism in Papua New Guinea. We didn't have to climb over 150 years of colonial government. We didn't have to climb over the kind of notion that there was a gold rush, that people wanted to just come and take the gold. We didn't have that in Papua. That's the difference. We had a national government, which was Papua New Guineans, who wanted to get a land claim that was fair for everybody in Papua New Guinea. I don't think that was the case here, except for some exceptions, like Minister McKnight and a few other people like that, who got to understand what the Yukon and First Nation people are about. That was the first 5 minutes of my 7-hour talk.
That was great. I think that brings us to question number 2, which I think Barry touched on a bit. But we'll start with, what do you think is working well? And what has surprised you about the last 25 years?
What has surprised me over the last 25 years, as we've said, we negotiated an agreement, and unfortunately, the people that were involved in the implementation, what the obligations, responsibilities, and funding is required, those people forgot what the spirit and intent of the agreements were. So obviously, I remember way back when, after the negotiations were finished, the government came to the table, federal government, because Canada was obligated to settle the agreements, fund the agreements according to the implementation plans. But you have to keep in mind that it's Indian Affairs. The Indian Affairs were the people that were stood in the way. And they went to the table and said, okay, now that you guys negotiated this agreement, we have no money. What's your next point? And since that time, they've been struggling from that day forward, trying to catch up on what the spirit and intent of those agreements are all about. So you got to keep in mind as well we have an Indian Act. In 1867, Canada was created. In 1876, we had an Indian Act that was established. That Indian Act is responsible for a lot of the responsibilities, negativities affecting Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And it's the Indian Act that created the residential schools. It was the Indian Act that created reservations. It was the Indian Act that prevented Aboriginal women from advancing ahead. And so we had that struggle. And then when we come to the claims negotiations, we were dealing with Indian Affairs policies, what the claims policies were, according to what they thought, according to what precedence in law was, and obviously not enough. And so we had a struggle from 1973 when we negotiated an agreement in 1982, I believe, based on the one government system, and that failed because and then we had the Prime Minister come up, John Turner, to Tagish to try to sell that agreement. And obviously that was not in our interest, and our people rejected that agreement based on 6 principles. And as a result of that, it forced the Government of Canada to commit a new review and a new policy for comprehensive claims in Canada. So hence, Bill McKnight and the new policy, in all fairness, came forward, and it had some self-government in there. We also have to keep in mind, too, that there was a First Minister's process conference going on, FMC they called it, where all the premiers and the Prime Minister and all the Aboriginal peoples were sitting around the table talking about Aboriginal interests and all the national interests that are affecting, our country. And so one of the things that they were dealing with was the inherent right to self-government. And that's one of the things that's missing today, is we have a self-government agreement, but that self-government agreement is in legislation, and it could be changed at any time by the Parliament of Canada. And so it doesn't give us any comfort in ensuring that we have, the self-government arrangements in place that protects our future and for the future generations. So anyways, I just wanted to comment on that.
Well, see, I guess one of the questions in terms of what's working, and I mean, there's still a lot of outstanding issues, but one of the things that the First Nations people did was they acknowledged and recognized that we had to work together with other people that lived here. One of the elders told me, you can't draw a line around yourself, that you have to deal with these other people. So in the process, we designed mechanisms of co-management. We provided a seat at the table for non-Native people to work directly with us at the community level. Renewable Resource Councils, the environmental assessment process, land use planning, the list goes on. We provided an opportunity to hear your voice and hope that you would be able to understand us and where we were coming from and the need to look after this land for everybody. It's not just for us. I'm fortunate that I have grandchildren and now great-grandchildren. I can speak to you directly on behalf of 4 generations of my immediate family. That's the kind of vision that we need to put forward in the Yukon and indeed in Canada. We can educate the rest of Canada and the rest of the world if we work together, and we can protect this land. Everybody knows the pressure that Yukon is under in terms of development pressure and climate change and all the other things. We've got the tools in the agreements to help maybe not solve the problems, but at least start addressing them and talking about where solutions might be. There's been a slow growth in our community governments, our self-governments. All nations are self-governing, whether they have an agreement or not. The agreements are just a way of writing it down and clarifying the relationships with other governments. So in my mind, all Yukon First Nations are self-governing. And that's where it came from, was from the elders, again, telling us we had our own way of looking after this land, of looking after each other. Today it's called government. Back then it was just looking out for each other and caring for the land. So that's continuing to grow. You have to realize we went from literally overnight from an Indian band dependent on the federal government in Ottawa to instantly a full-blown independent government the very next day. We had to create all the institutional tools. Your constitution, your laws, your bylaws, your policies, your procedures, all of that stuff that runs a government. So it's been a slow evolution of all of those things, but it's happening. Surprised? Well, maybe not so surprised, but I think the need for continued negotiations. Everybody says, oh yeah, you can take time off after the agreements are completed. Guess what? We're still at the table. As Victor pointed out, we had to negotiate or renegotiate the terms of implementation because it was literally the Crown picked a number out of the air. It's not based on anything. We had a strategic process laid out where we were looking at every provision of the agreement. What was the responsibility? What was the activity? What was the timing or duration that would generate a cost? Well, the government figured out real quick, they just did math. They said, okay, we do this for the whole agreement for one First Nation times 14 First Nation, and heaven help us if it happens right across country, it's over 600 Aboriginal groups. So they just went, you know, millions, billions, trillions, and basically shut the process down. They pulled a number out of the air, and they based it on their existing Indian affairs funding, status Indians only. So First Nations were 50%, at least 50% underfunded from the beginning of the process. The populations are different among each First Nation. As Vic pointed out, it was created by the government, Indian Act, and various statutes that enfranchise people. In the early days, you couldn't even work for the church unless you gave up your status. You couldn't work on the riverboat unless you gave up your status. You couldn't join the army unless you gave up your status. Right? This was do away with the Indians. Well, it's still here today, I'll tell you. I hate to say it. My great-grandchildren are fighting the battles that we had to fight to get recognized as an Indian. Some people won't acknowledge that they're Indian because they get better services as a non-Indian. Health, medical stuff. You know, I mean, it's sad to say, but we fought like heck for what? Just to carry on the fight. We're still here. I'm not going anywhere. Got nowhere to go. So the limitations in terms of the implementation, I mean, funding is one thing, but just the interpretation of the agreement. I've heard people say, no, it doesn't mean that. I said, well, were you there? I was there when we talked about that provision. I know what the intent was. I know what the meaning is. Right? So that kind of stuff still goes on. You have undercutting of the agreements and limiting the interpretation, narrowing the scope of the application. It's almost like we have to renegotiate every provision that we already negotiated. Right? And the other item I'm a bit disappointed is that we need to take legal action to implement the agreement. It's gotten so bad now, there's a phrase out there, it's implementation by litigation. And it's not just Yukon Indian people that are going to court, it's other people outside of Canada that are also going to court and winning. But that doesn't mean anything to the federal government. They've lost a number of court cases dealing with their obligation to Aboriginal people. That's another term they use from time to time, which deals with the enfranchising of women in particular, where they've lost their status because of their marriage. They've lost those court cases, but they still haven't done anything. They've got negative ruling from various tribunals. They still haven't done anything. So I guess it's no surprise that they're going to leave our constitutional contract on the back burner. Mussy.
Barry?
I can move us along pretty quickly here by just saying ditto. I mean, everything both Albert and Victor said, I think I would say in spades. It's correct. It's the reason that the potential that we had when we signed off the agreement is being lost, it's being squandered. You know, I was in the middle of a big dispute in BC recently between all the people who were harvesting fish and salmon, and basically it got to the point where guns were being brought out on the Fraser River, and the fight was about who was going to kill the last salmon. So we went into a process, basically a negotiation process that my partner and I were the facilitators of. And there was somebody, an old commercial fisherman, had been a commercial fisherman for 3 generations, and notoriously known for his kind of right-wing thoughts, said at the end of one of the sessions we had, he said, and everybody was asked who was at the session to say, what is your hope for the future? And he said, my hope for the future is that my grandson will be sitting around this table and will still be talking. And that's what needs to happen. We need to still be talking. Change happens, and we need to have the relationships built up that allow us to be able to deal with the change in a constructive, positive way. There's a huge opportunity that the land claim agreement gave to the Yukon. You know, the federal government has said many times they'll never do again what they did here. We pushed it because we had that mutual trust. It was hard to get Ottawa to understand the elders saying, we're not extinguishing our Aboriginal obligations. You call them rights and titles, we call them obligations. We need to look after this land, we need to look after our people. We don't want to own the land, we want to make sure we can take care of it. And I remember, and I'm sure Victor does too, the fateful night when we basically had a meeting late at night in Ottawa with the various ministers. And they got the message, and Minister McKnight was a farmer. And so as a farmer, he was a very practical man, and somebody that knew you had to do things in a practical way, in a respectful way. And he finally said to his bureaucrats, I don't know what you're going to do, but you go and do it. We're not extinguishing their land. We're not extinguishing their title to that land. We're not going to do that. And as Dave Joe famously said, when one of his legal advocates said, well, you know, we don't know. We want to extinguish because we don't know what's in their Aboriginal title. Who knows? It may be that Aboriginal title means the criminal code doesn't apply. And Dave Joe said, as negotiator for the First Nation, said, yeah, we really worry about that because most of us here are just on parole. And the rest of us are in jail. So, I mean, I really fundamentally believe that Albert said it right. There was a spirit, a sense of connection, a sense of being sharing and finding out how our differences can be worked out together that came out of that land claim. That was the excitement. The surprise for me, and as I say, I've looked at it pretty closely. The surprise for me was that we lost that we lost sight of that the mandate for the federal government became not a fair deal, not a fair negotiation, but it really became, how can we reduce our costs? How can we make this cost go away? It doesn't need to be that expensive. We can find ways. If you put good people in a room in a good process, they'll come up with innovative ways of solving a problem that nobody ever thought of. And after 55 years, I understand the power of putting people in what traditional people used to do. All cultures did at one time when there were no disposable people and we had to get along. All cultures sat in a circle and tried to work out something that would enable all of them to be able to go forward in a respectful way. And we've lost sight of that. I mean, I remember, Albert, you'll remember this, we had a big fight at the land claim table. No, we can't have these joint boards. We can't have these joint responsibilities, right? Because you know, all the Aboriginal people will be against development and all the white people will be for development. Well, we finally said at the table, I remember this, let's test it out. This is all just theories. Let's go to Mayo and we'll set up a process just in Mayo to see whether or not it'll work. Remember that? Yeah. So we tried to do that, and we did that. And guess what? Lots of the Aboriginal people wanted development. Lots of white people wanted no development. Because it's going to be a conversation. If we create a safe place to have difficult conversations, people are going to have all sorts of different ideas, all sorts of different things about what they think will work, and they need to have that safe place where they trust each other to talk about it and work it out. That's the biggest thing that I think we've lost, is that ability to be able to trust each other and work together. And we don't build that here. We don't build it across our backyard fences. We're not going to sure as hell build it across national borders. And we can see all over the world, when you don't trust somebody, what happens, right? We have to change the way in which we deal with our difficulties in a way that respects all the voices in the room. And soon I hope to hear your voices, because I think we've been talking too much up here.
Good segue. So we're going to open it up to questions in the audience.
You know, thank you so much for being here, first of all. But a lot of what you guys have been talking about is this spirit of trust and partnership. And what I'm gathering is that the sense that that's been lost. Do you have ideas about how we can regain that spirit and that sense in today's conversations?
You know, one of the practical ideas might be, and I don't know how far this would go, because we're still lucky that most of us old folks are still alive that negotiated that agreement, to sit in a room like this with all the negotiators that are currently negotiating implementation and go through it section by section and say, here's what we intended, like Vic said, this is what we thought we left behind for you to do. I think that one of the biggest flaws and the biggest mistake that I made personally was that we thought that would happen naturally. We thought, you know, because we did engage a lot of the public servants in the process. We really opened it up to them as well. And I just expected that to happen, and it hasn't. So I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying that those public servants are getting a different mandate than the one that we got at the table. The one that we got at the table was clearly, and the federal team was 100% behind it, let's find our way to a fair agreement. That was the mandate. And I think we did that in many respects. I mean, there may be some things we didn't do and didn't anticipate, but sure. But I think that would at least say, okay, let's be honest, folks. You know, that's the expectation they left the negotiations with. That's the expectation that the feds certainly talked about leaving the table, and it certainly was Pennickett's intent to be able to honor that agreement.
Yes, I agree. We did. I would admit that we made a mistake when we finished the negotiations. We should not have left the implementation to a group of other people that did not understand. Of course, we didn't realize that Indian Affairs would come to the table with no money as well. And so that's something that needs to be looked at. And I think going forward, what I'd like to see is that and there aren't many people around that have the corporate memory on what actually took place at the negotiating table. There's 3 people here, maybe 1 or 2 other people that I see, you know, that have that experience. And what we see at this other table is nobody has gone through the corporate experience at the negotiating table, and they don't have that responsibility there at all. So there's a big mistake there, I think. So they got to go back there and try and fix that. And of course, looking forward, we hear the Prime Minister talk about his wish list here about making a new agreement. He says this nothing better, nothing more important to him than having the Aboriginal or Indigenous relationship fixed. And we're still waiting for that to be done. His problem is going to be Indian Affairs. And as long as those people are standing in the way, there will be a problem. He will never achieve his objective of getting an agreement by next year, before the next election, next year. But I think there's opportunities there, you know, by creating a First Ministers, bringing them together and dealing with that stuff in a proper way, the way we had talked about it. And that's still unfinished business, I think, you know, as we look forward.
Well, see, yeah, I think an important part, and both Barry and Victor talked about, is ongoing discussions, communication, with each other, forums like this. I keep saying the Yukon Self-Government Agreement is the best kept secret in Canada. Not a heck of a lot of people know about it, and I'm surprised within government, they know very little about what's going on in the Yukon. You know, for example, the First Nations Authority is equal to the federal government. If we were to occupy the field on every field of authority that we have under self-government, we would displace all the federal laws that exist in Yukon. And our laws are paramount to Yukon government laws. I mean, you'd think with all that as backdrop, it would highlight the need to work together, government to government. We should be co-developing legislation for the Yukon, not have YTG and the feds doing their own thing, and we as First Nation governments doing our own thing. There needs to be some uniformity amongst the governments in terms of their approach, and working together is one way of doing that. Vic talked a bit about the financial arrangements. There needs to be a new fiscal relationship. You know, there's a financial transfer process between the feds and the province and the territory. Well, where's the First Nation governments? We're still going cap in hand to the Department of Indian Affairs. This treaty is with the Government of Canada. It's not with the Department of Indian Affairs. So the federal government needs to get their house in order to start implementing this treaty in accordance with its terms. Because I'll let a bit of a secret out of the bag that these folks probably already know, but the Land Claims Treaty, the settlement, is a conditional treaty. It's a conditional agreement. The terms of the conditions are the agreement itself. You'll notice that the signature block is at the front of the agreements. Most agreements, the signature block is at the back, right? And look at the last paragraph in the signature page. That's what characterizes it as a conditional surrender. So that's something else. I'll leave you with that thought.
Gentlemen, such a pleasure. And I guess it's not necessarily a question, but I think it needs to be said. The current Prime Minister has committed to developing legislation, federal legislation for the protection of Aboriginal languages, the new Aboriginal Languages Act. Now, a couple of weeks ago, probably about 3 weeks ago now, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the representatives were here, not in consultation with Yukon First Nations, but rather having an engagement. It would be good to talk a little bit about that. But more importantly, I'd like to hear your thoughts on why this process would actually be brought into the Yukon when we have two different avenues to deal with that. Certainly the self-government agreements don't speak specifically to languages, and as we know, those agreements are under the auspices of legislation itself. But the Heritage Agreement, I think it's number 13, speaks specifically to Aboriginal languages. So why then do you think the Government of Canada would be taking this approach when we clearly have a process and they clearly have a desire?
Yeah, you're right, Shirley. It's Chapter 13 of the Umbrella and the First Nation Final Agreements that deal with heritage. And again, that point I made out is that the First Nation have jurisdiction. Ideally, laws should be co-developed. We would work together to draft the laws. I think why the federal government is taking this approach is they need their legislation to enable them to talk to us. They need a mandate to talk to us and also to fund commitments they make. Because we've heard it time and time again, oh, I can talk to you, but I have no money, I have no spending authority. Got to go back to cabinet, got to go to Treasury Board, got to go to Privy Council. I mean, I call it snakes and ladders every time we engage with the feds. And they're using that term engagement now because consultation is a defined term in our agreement. There's a defined process, steps that you need to go through. Plus, they've been advised by courts in decisions about how to conduct consultation. Well, there's a new one being added to the list. It's called accommodation. They haven't even tackled that one yet.
Like always, Shirley, tough question. Yeah, I really sadly think that the only institution in Canada that's listening or is aware of the history and the legal history as well as the social and political history are the courts. It is in Section 13. It is quite clear. It is a constitutional document. It is a paramount legislation. And it was first and foremost in all the elders and all of the First Nations at the table, and totally recognized by the two other negotiating teams that culture and language were essential for First Nation people to get back on their feet again. Absolutely essential. You know, I want to say one thing that was a real funny thing that happened during the negotiations. So during the negotiations, the Yukon Association of Municipalities, all the mayors and the council people, I wanted to engage them, right? Because they were living with First Nations on a day-to-day basis in most of the small communities. And everybody was really worried. But I decided that what we should do, the team decided what we should do, is break up the mayors and councillors into different teams to do a moot negotiation on land claims on just land, okay? So they were broken into two teams. One team was to represent First Nation people, and one team was to present the government position. Only on quantum of land. What was the percentage that we were talking about on the table? 20-80, 25-75 in terms of land? Something like that. Something like that. You know what all of those teams of mayors and councils decided would be fair? 50-50. 50-50. Nobody could believe in government that those folks would think on the basis they were here first, they need land more than we do because basically, and so what I said to the government one day when I was having a hard time, what if the Indians said to us, why don't we try to justify why we need so much land? I don't know where I would have found anything persuasive to suggest that we would have as much land as we now do. And I can see why they could justify quite easily something different. So there's a whole misconception about what I think a lot of Yukoners on the street really want to do. I mean, my sense is, then and now, that there are more people, particularly old-time Yukoners, who want to have the good relationships with First Nations. And we need that voice to come forward, because the only voice that's coming forward now is the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. Think about it. Supposing you own a major corporation and you want to put a mine, okay? Who do you talk to in Ottawa? You talk to the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources. If you were a First Nation person and you wanted to do the mine, who do you talk to? The Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. If they shut that thing down, then you as a First Nation person and you as a non-First Nation person would be able to talk directly. I would say that the reason we got the claim we did is because the federal team of negotiators opened the door to us to talk directly to the Department of Finance, directly to the Department of Health, and directly to the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources, so that we could make our case, not them making the case on our behalf, because they don't understand, the bureaucrats in the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, what's going on here. You better edit that out of the film.
Well, good afternoon, boys. It's been a long time. I want to thank all the people for coming and showing up here. My name is Stan and Julie. I was one of the community negotiators, and they were the table negotiators, as you would say. But if you look at the spirit and intent of the agreement and what it means today for Yukoners, as Elijah Smith would say, this land claims agreement is not only for First Nation people, it's for all Yukoners. And that is the case today. But if you look at the spirit intent didn't happen 30 years ago. It's continuous. The trust is continuous. And you wake up every morning, it's like going to sleep and waking up. It's part of life. And every day, you got to be able to work on that. You got to work on the spirit intent agreements and the spirit intent of your life and the trust with the government. It's the same thing. It's life. And that's my education to you. The other part is the fact that not speaking out of thin air, but the implementation of those agreements is that's the important part of it. What did we do? What did we accomplish on the spirit and intent of the agreements? And where are we at today? Is basically how do we look at a report card for ourselves and what we have done? What do we have accomplished? And through the looking at negotiations, through the 1870 orders, 1763, Proclamation 1763, and basically how did we get here today? For Old Crow, how did we implement? What did we do? The First Nation is still like the main employee in Old Crow. So if we're looking at what we want for an economic base, we're still working at that for ourselves. And what does that mean? Politically and practically. Does that mean we mine and put a big hole in the ground? How do we get our money? How do we get off our high horse to basically be independent and to some degree? We have those obligations from Canada. I realize that. The other part is what do we have done? We took part of our land called Fishing Branch River, Nain Lean Jig. We implemented that. The whole watershed is protected. We did that through negotiations. We implemented part of that agreement. And what do all Yukoners want? They want clean air, they want clean water, clean water to drink, and they want land. We did part of that in Old Crow. We took the extent of the agreements, we implemented. Whereas we did not complain to government to say, hey, our water's not good, we need to protect this land, we need to do this. We just did it. We took the agreements, we implemented it. The agreements that you negotiated, and we sat down and negotiated. The principle of it, we took part of that, Chapter 10, we implemented that, we protected half the size of PEI. One watershed, after the fact. So, after the fact, the settlement. And it's our First Nation, and plus the government working together in partnership with the governments to do this. And if, I would say, like if anybody looked at this and say, well, hey, how did you accomplish that? How did you ever do that? Because it wasn't possible. We did the impossible to implement that part of the agreement from our First Nation. We protected, through the agreements, is looking at the parks and Vantut, and we got Settlement Island on one side, Park on the other side. We protected that watershed. We've also just recently looked at the Bell River watershed. We protected that. So what more can we do? We've gone to the extent to implement our agreements that we can, so other First Nations can look at that and say, well, hey, the other First Nations are not saying, well, hey, how did you do that? How did you accomplish that? We can help answer those questions. How do we implement? How did we get there? So to implement what the Yukoners want, the Intertribal Watershed, which is international, have done a lot for the Yukon River system, and that's water. We need water. Simple. We need to protect it. That's the practical side of things. That's why we got these land claims agreements, so we could have that. And if you sit down and talk about implementation of the federal government today, you're talking, if you want to implement the 28 chapters, and if we want to implement the 28 chapters to the final agreements, we're looking at talking to 200 civil servants across Canada. Is that possible? That's impossible. We need another solution. If we want to implement portion of the agreements in terms of the finance, we get a directive from Cabinet. And that's how it gets done. And if we don't get a directive, it doesn't get implemented. How do we get from point A to point B? Is to do this, is to be at the table. And another thing that you boys could influence is the First Nations having an office in Ottawa. We don't have that. Every claimant group has an office in Ottawa to implement agreements. We do not have that. We're still behind on that factor. So that's something that we need to establish. And so I'm rambling. So if you got any questions, so that's just some of my comments I'd like to make. And I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Like that and like that. That's it.
Jeez. I just want to thank everybody for coming. And I hope that we've inspired some of you to have an ongoing discussion among and between all Yukoners. I hope that we've done that. I think I understand why I was so emotional in the beginning. it was seeing that young offender facility and understanding that we have not worked together on the justice issues in this territory, and that the justice issues are getting worse, and that they don't need to be that way. We don't need to be sending people to jail who aren't really criminals, that have social problems, not criminal problems so much. I think that I was emotional because I'm just finishing 41 chapters on Johnny Johns, who's an elder here, and I wish that I had done the research that I've done to finish that book before I ever sat on the bench and before I ever did land claims, because it would have been different.
Again, thank you for coming out. This is an important topic for all Yukon people. Not only Yukon people, but should be something that all Canadians should be, looking at this kind of a process that, and it's not finished, and it's something that's ongoing. And what I see happening now is that we need to look at the economics of our people. The economics has to be shared. And this is something that we need to look now. Good agreements, not motherhood clauses that says, we agree with opportunities, but we need to know what those are in very specific terms. And there's a number of mines that are being proposed, and those agreements have to be held up so they demonstrate what the spirit and intent of what those agreements that are signed by First Nations. The resource companies have to understand that. And of course, when we look at those benefits that take place, there's a lot of revenues that are generated from tax, all that stuff when development happens, and we should be part of that. Thank you.
Masicho. Also, I'd like to thank all of you for your time and your attendance. I think the last message I'd like to leave is that there still exists a huge potential here to build, secure, healthy, prosperous communities. Focus on unity, community. In our negotiations, NND actually invited the village of Mayo. We had the final negotiations in the community hall. It was open to the public. We had the village of Mayo actually sitting on our side of the table with the feds and YTG on the other side. So anytime YTG went to caucus, we asked the village, can you go caucus for those guys and come back and let us know? So anyways, the point is, we were already working together during negotiations. We were one of the first communities to create what's now referred to as a joint council process, where we sit down with the municipal government and our Nutchinekdun government to talk about community priorities and kind of planning forward on how we do things together for the benefit of the community. So there's a huge potential that exists here, and hopefully with your learning and education going forward, that you'll be able to participate and help build this new Yukon going forward. Masi.
Well, Albert, Victor, Barry, thank you so much for your time today. I can't speak for all of you, but I've been working with my land claim since Colonial First Nation did its ratification vote, and I've learned more in this hour than I have learned in a number of years. I wish somebody would have organized this before I started working on that claim. I haven't thought about lunch once, so that tells you how very engaged I've been. We want to thank you not only for your time today and your passion today, but for all the work that you did for all Yukoners for so long. For that. I want to thank everybody here for coming. Great audience. We want to take this opportunity to let you know that this is a series, and so we'll have our next one near the end of October. We're aiming for October 24th. The intention with that one is to hear from the 3 First Nations who have not signed on to the Umbrella Final Agreement. I think that will be an incredibly interesting conversation. We hope to do more of these, and I can speak for Yukon College. We're very humbled that we can be a part of this as an education institution and offer these opportunities for our staff and our students to hear from people who broke trail and changed the world. So, goodness, cheese.